This is a test of the emergency ThoughtCast system. In the event of an actual emergency, please stop, drop, and roll.
Hey there, partner. Welcome back to the couch. Today, in addition to addressing the literal elephant in the room, I want to address the figurative one. Don't say its name 3 times, whatever you do. Actually, I'm just kidding. I don't want to talk politics with you. Your friendship is too valuable to me. And I'm enjoying a nice little break from all the partisan bickering now that the presidential election is finally over. But I do want to talk about a related issue. Why is politics so hard to talk about? Now, that might sound like a stupid question because government policy affects all of our lives. So it's only natural that we should be passionate about government policy. But when you think about it, any one person's individual opinion about what that policy should be has zero effect on policy or our lives. So Uncle Joe might be in favor of keeping domesticated tigers in our area, and that idea might scare us. But unless his last name is Stalin, right, there is little chance that his opinion is going to have any direct effect on how likely it is we see a stray tiger in our backyard.
Anybody home?
And yet we see other people's opinions as threats to us. And we treat them like our enemies. So is this unwillingness to engage in civic discourse a threat to our democracy? Right? Especially in a day and age when we have social media platforms that seem to be amplifying inflammatory hate speech and extreme views on both sides. But if you think about it, politics has always been hard to talk about, which indicates to me that really the heart of the issue has something to do with our biology. So today I want to identify what the problem is and see if there isn't something that we can do about it. And if I'm right, if it is universal, then maybe the first step on the road to recovery is admitting that we have a problem. So let me be the first to do that. Partner, I have a problem keeping my cool in certain political conversations. There, I said it. Here's an example. I was on the phone with my dad, and we were having a great conversation, laughing and joking. And then we started talking about the Supreme Court Justice nomination. And we hit on a minor point of disagreement, and things got a little tense. And then suddenly, I'm on my feet, pacing the room, right? Yelling into the receiver, not even listening to what my dad might be saying, because it doesn't matter at that point. And eventually hanging up the phone in anger. Is that pathological? What happened here? How is it possible for 2 people who love and respect each other to go from that relationship to one where we're acting like bitter enemies in the course of seconds? And is this why we have the phrase, wow, things really escalated quickly? Okay, well, after I cooled off, I had this instinct to want to blame my dad for forcing me to act that way. But I don't think that's productive. So instead, let's see if we can identify maybe some common threads in all these political discussions that just end in dumpster fires. You know, in every political conversation that I've ever been in, I'm always wearing pants. Is that just a weird coincidence? Hear me out. I'm trying to imagine what would have happened in that conversation with my dad if it had happened over Zoom and during that moment of conflict, we both jumped up in anger and suddenly realized that neither one of us had bothered to put on pants that day. And we're both standing there shouting in our underwear. Does the conversation still break down, or do we just break out in a fit of hysterical laughter? So what if we had some sort of visual cue in these moments to remind ourselves to not take ourselves so seriously? And what if that's what that Nelly song is really about, right? It's getting hot in here, so take off all your clothes. That was an educational song. Okay, but if the relevant variable here is not pants, maybe it is heat. So you're probably thinking that's obvious. The clues are built right into our language. And if I was trying to describe that conversation with my dad to you, I might say something like, we were having a political conversation that got heated. And I could tell I was getting a little hot under the collar. And even though my dad tried to lower the temperature in the room, I lost my cool. And if you think about it, what do we call this entire class of political issues that reliably lead to these meltdowns? We call them hot button issues. So in addition to heat, maybe there's also a button. So what does the expression, "you really know how to push my buttons," say about our intuition? Do we feel in certain circumstances that we act or react like biological machines? Or put even more strongly, in the absence of free will? Because if I think back to that conversation with my dad, my subjective experience was hearing myself say all of these words for the very first time without any kind of prior thought or intention of speaking them. So when we push the button on our dishwasher, our dishes get clean. When we push the button on our microwave, our food heats up. When we push each other's buttons, do we heat up automatically? Well, if so, to me that indicates that there might be some kind of state change happening in our bodies. So I have a metaphor to try to understand this concept of a state change. It's an imperfect metaphor, but I like it because it involves tea. What if we are like teapots, and our default internal state is like water? We're calm, we're cool, and we go with the flow. But if you add heat into that system, if you turn on the burner, slowly beneath the surface, things start to heat up. And eventually you reach some sort of threshold, and that water turns into steam, which is more volatile, more dangerous, and when it starts spewing out of our spout, it makes all these loud, obnoxious sounds. So are we like teapots getting heated in these political conversations? Or maybe we can think about this state change like a transformation. Think about some of our popular myths, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the Wolfman, or the Incredible Hulk. All of these characters transform into stronger, more dangerous, and less rational versions of themselves. So do these myths reflect something about our shared experience? Okay, I realize I've given you a lot of these imperfect metaphors. So I think what I'm trying to say is that if we appeal to our intuition alone, it seems like there's a button. And when that button gets pushed, it leads to a state change in our bodies. And we experience that transformation as heat. And if that's the case, is there something in our biology, a mechanism that can explain this whole process? Well, there is something called the sympathetic nervous system. The SNS is responsible for our fight or flight reflex to clear and present danger in our environment. So imagine that you're picking berries in the forest, and suddenly a snake darts out from under that bush. Your SNS automatically reacts, and within seconds, a flash flood of adrenaline enters your system, along with all these other stress hormones that cause this global state change in our bodies. Our heart starts beating out of our chest, right? And we start breathing heavily. Our circulatory system goes into overdrive and starts pumping blood into all of our muscles so that we can grab the nearest club and beat that snake to death or run away as fast as possible. Our bodies are like race cars right? Revving the engine, trying to get a good jump off of the starting line. And because we're trying to fuel this massive burst of energy, we have to divert resources away from other non-essential systems. And unfortunately for us, those non-essential systems include things like our prefrontal cortex, which we use to self-reflect, right? To plan and to rationalize, to use logic. So does this not map onto our lived experience in these moments almost perfectly? And so I guess if this SNS is getting activated, then the question is why? Why should a system that is supposed to respond to things like lions and tigers and bears, oh my, respond to ideas and opinions of other people? Why are we getting these false alarms? There's probably a lot of different things that could be happening here. Maybe a big one is the fact that someone else's difference in opinion seems to imply that we are wrong. And so maybe we perceive that as a threat to our ego. And if other people are around, a threat to our social status. Or maybe our identity is threatened in these situations. Or maybe these hot button issues, right, things like abortion, immigration, drugs, guns, maybe they tend to dredge up these traumatic experiences from our past. And when we're reliving these memories, this activates this system. But we all know that everyone has different buttons that get pushed. And so regardless of what causes this system to activate, if it's all automatic and we have no control, then the question really is, what is the solution? Is there a solution? Or is this the reason that we have yet to solve this problem? So a few years back, I was having a conversation with a friend about the travel ban. And I think I must have gotten triggered because at some point I just started rehashing my argument, only louder and more aggressively at my friend. And I think this is where the chain reaction happens, right? My SNS triggers me and I get aggressive and that's perceived as a threat. And then your SNS is triggered and we either start shouting at each other or we both bolt for the nearest exit. Not so with this particular friend. In fact, he remained totally cool, nonchalant, just like the fawns. And remember what I said about, well, maybe we need some sort of visual cue or feedback to tell us to not take ourselves so seriously in these moments. He provided the right feedback because in that moment, I could see that I was not in any sort of confrontational or threatening situation. And I calmed down, and we had a great conversation. Now, it turns out that this friend has Asperger's. So that means he's totally normal, super intelligent, but he's just a little less sensitive to the emotional cues coming from other people. Right? So all that aggressive force just bounced off of him. Pretty cool, right? And the takeaway from this, at least what I take away, is that if one person can keep their cool, then we can salvage these conversations. So if we're the one being triggered, there's not much we can do. But if we can learn to identify when someone else is starting to transform, right, can we think about ourselves in this capacity for trying to do damage control?
Sun's getting real low.
Well, I've tried to develop a technique for how to do that. And I think these three basic things help me manage the situation. The first is to take a deep breath and exhale out slowly. Because this triggers our parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and digest. And then the second thing to to do is let your partner finish and then acknowledge their emotions in a positive way. And then the third is to ask them a follow-up question instead of trying to argue the point further. So if you put all of this together, this is what it looks like. Imagine that you are speaking your mind to me. Partner, I can see that you're really passionate about this issue. That's great. Would you like to tell me about a personal experience that you've had that you think informs your opinion on this topic? So step 1 is to calm ourselves down. Step 2 is to provide the right type of positive feedback to that person. And the third step is to ask them a question to try to re-engage some of these systems in the prefrontal cortex that are starting to shut down. So any forest fire starts with a single spark. And if we're there with a glass of water to put that flame out before it gets out of control, then we can start having political conversations again. So we all had a feeling that the heart of the issue was in managing our emotions. In particular, our negative emotions like fear. And I realize that that is not easy. But we can get better with practice. Imagine if a surgeon could never overcome the fear of accidentally killing their patient. Or if an actor could never overcome the fear of appearing foolish on stage. Unmanaged fears become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Because the shaky-handed surgeon just cuts too deep, or the nervous actor pees themselves. But how are we supposed to practice talking politics when we react to the political conversation as if it were a snake on the ground and we automatically run the other way? We cannot let our fear of failure become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In my mind, the real danger to society, the real threat to democracy, is not that we are incapable of communicating. It is that we are slowly convincing ourselves of this mass delusion. Turn on the news or your social media feed. Do you hear any solutions? Or do you hear hysterical people saying hysterical things like, OMG, we are so polarized. It is so totally impossible to talk to anyone. Partner, will we descend into civil war? Will the very fabric of society be torn asunder? Will we slip into some kind of dystopian future where an authoritarian government is forced to drug us to keep our emotions in check because we can't learn to manage them on our own? That is a giant bologna sandwich. And these are the wrong kinds of emotional signals to be sending one another. We need emotions to motivate us to action, but negative emotions motivate us to move away from each other, towards the gun stores, whereas positive emotions motivate us to come together. So here is the right kind of signal to send. Partner, I am 100% confident that we can solve any issue, political or otherwise, if we can find a way to motivate ourselves to come together and talk it out. And when enough of us can figure out how to do that without losing our cool, then we'll be able to see our differences of opinion not as a weakness in society, but as a strength. And if I've convinced you that there's even a glimmer of hope, then you need to share this video so that I can convince somebody else. It's so great to talk to you, partner. I will see you next time on The Joy of Thinking.
This has been a test of the emergency ThoughtCast system. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we're going to try to fight it.
We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire, so we didn't light it, but we tried to find it.